Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Better Sex Podcast. This is Jessa, and as always, I'm just so thankful that you're here, that you're choosing to spend some time with me. Today's episode sort of straddles a few different topics, but I guess I'd say it's largely rooted in communication. Kristen Lilla is joining me, and she wrote a book that's got chapters about a whole variety of things with exercises related to all of them, which I love because I love giving action steps. But as she says, it all starts out with communication. You got to be able to talk about these things if you're going to address them. And I really agree with this because this really lines up with the second pillar of the Intimacy with Ease method about aligning with your partner, which absolutely includes communication and sort of relationship strategies to get you on a solid foundation, getting you working as a team, developing those communication skills so that you're missing any sort of strain of, feeling like you're oppositional or you've got competing goals or you're avoiding the whole thing or you're defensive, some of these problems, right, that are going to keep you stuck in your sex life. So Kristen joins me today to talk about sexual awareness, but more about communication, vulnerability, and how you work towards that with your partner. I hope you get a lot out of it. And before we start the show today, it is sponsored by Intimacy with Ease. It's a method to help otherwise happy couples achieve a sex life that is easy and fun for both of them, so that you can actually just enjoy your sex life with zero stress. For more information, if you want to watch a brief little training video that's available, all of that, go to intimacywithease.com. So, Kristen, thank you so much for being with me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I especially appreciated hearing you have a 6-month-old baby. It's really hard to fit extra things in, so I doubly appreciate it.
Working from home has helped with that. So.
Yeah. So I looked at, you sent me the copy of your book, which I found fascinating, and it covers so much ground. I'm trying to figure out, wow, what do we talk about today? So I sort of wanted to dig in around communication and vulnerability and how to have conversations with our partners.
Awesome.
So I don't know, do you want to frame that up a little bit about, where that fits in your book, first of all?
Yeah. And let me summarize. I feel like my intention, like behind the thought process behind the book, that there are so many books out there on individual topics, and right, you can read 300 pages on low libido or on polyamory. And I find that sometimes that's overwhelming for both myself as a clinician, but also for clients. And so I wanted to be able to have something that kind of cut to the chase, but also that was something practical. So every single chapter has exercises at the end of each chapter. And a lot of them, if you don't have the issue, whatever the topic is, a lot of times the exercise is still relevant. So like for people reading the erectile dysfunction chapter, there's some exercises at the end about mindfulness, right? So somebody even who is having anxiety or low libido, right, could read the exercises anyway at the end of that chapter. So lots of conversation starters for couples to just kind of dive in and get moving and get going. And when I was organizing it, right, it's like, where do you start? And I think that as therapists and clinicians, so often communication ends up being a conversation with our clients.
Right.
And if we can't talk about sex, how are we going to improve upon, your sex life? And so being able to make those conversations more comfortable. So I really started in with communication, but also vulnerability, because we often don't talk about sex in our society. We're expected to have sex, but not talk about sex. And so it's really uncomfortable for a lot of people. And it's a vulnerable conversation. And so how can we make some of those things easier? So that was where the book starts, is communication and vulnerability and normalizing those things too.
Right. Well, I love how, I took a similar approach, like practical, doable action steps, right? Not just read about something conceptually, but like, how do we apply this?
Exactly. Let's do something with it. Yeah.
Right. That's how I think we actually change. So
exactly.
Well, let me ask you this. Where do you sort of start off a conversation about communication or vulnerability? Is there anything you want to define or sort of tee up before we talk about what that might look like or what people would do with that?
That's so hard because I think it varies so much depending on who you're talking to, right? That especially with couples, that sometimes couples are really good at communication. They just don't know how to have a conversation. Sometimes they're not very good at communication, right? And so we need to take a step back then and talk about how to have a conversation without arguing or just sweeping it under the rug. So I think that there's so many variables that kind of come into play. And you know this very well, is what was our upbringing related to communication as well. And that has such a huge factor in it. And so, right, families that don't communicate a lot, oftentimes that it's hard to communicate then when you're in a relationship, or families that maybe over communicate or yell when they communicate. And that's what you do to communicate. So some of it, I think, is even just understanding communication styles before you can actually learn how to communicate.
Yeah. So what would you say are some of the biggest pitfalls people have with communication and what they might want to do differently?
Yeah. The two that came to mind pretty quickly were defensiveness and just avoidance, right?
Yeah.
So, and we've all been there. We've all gotten defensive about something, but the minute we start to get defensive, we're not actually listening to what somebody's saying anymore. We're just gearing up for the next thing to say. And so that's obviously not helpful. It's not going to resolve anything. So I think that's a common pitfall. But I also think that avoidance, especially with the topic of sexuality, is huge. I also teach sex education. And so there's so many parents, we just don't have that conversation, or we had that conversation once and just avoiding the topic completely, right?
Right.
And so some of it's learning like, okay, well, how do we have a conversation? Because it can be uncomfortable. That's actually okay, right? It's okay to be uncomfortable, but that's better than avoiding.
Yeah. And so where does vulnerability come into this? Is that just about the subject matter because sex is so private, or, whatever people feel about it, right?
Yes, but not necessarily. I think sometimes it's just sharing even just our emotions, and that can be really vulnerable. I share this in the book, but I'm going to share it because it's one of my favorite stories about being vulnerable. That my grandpa was raised in a generation, in a household, right? They didn't say those. He didn't say anything about emotions. He was the guy who he'd slip you $20. That was his way of saying, I care about you.
Right.
And while that was appreciated as a kid, right? As I got older, I was like, this is kind of weird. And so I bet I was in my 20s, and I called my grandpa, and at the end of the conversation, I was like, I'm going to do it. And I said, I love you. And he hung up the phone on me. And I was like, all right, cool. And I had very low expectations, thankfully.
Right.
But I also really put myself out there, and he literally hung up the phone on me. So over the years, I just was like, I'm just going to keep doing it because it was vulnerable for me to do. It clearly made him vulnerable and made him very uncomfortable. But over the years, we eventually he'd be like, okay, bye, bye. And then eventually it was like, you too, bye. And I think maybe once or twice he said, I love you too, bye. And that's been such a cool progression that, he was in his 80s probably when I initiated this conversation. He's 90 now. And, it's kind of a cool thing to see that even from a generational standpoint, people can change, but also the payoff that I think that, if my grandfather passed away and I'd never said, I love you, I think I would have regretted that. And so I think that's part of vulnerability too. And I will own it was totally a selfish thing on my part, that it was something I needed to do for me and wanted to share that with him.
So I guess in the way you're talking about this, vulnerability is about risk taking.
Absolutely.
Doing something that's scary or opens you up to something.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. And I love your point about, maybe it was selfish, but it was also in his interest too. That's where things come together. The things we need to do for us often benefit those people around us, right?
This is true. There was a lesson in communication as well there.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those examples that, people might go, oh, well, your grandpa loves you, or he loves you. He knows you love him. And it's like, yeah, but wouldn't it be cool if we just said it and confirmed those things instead of making, right? I say this all the time in therapy. We're terrible mind readers. We are all terrible mind readers. And so rather than assuming, let's just have a conversation about it.
Well, and it's a different experience to hear it, to take a moment, even if it is known, to
Absolutely.
Get, in that moment, be in it and acknowledge it in a sort of a different way.
Yeah, there's a validation piece that comes with it.
Right. So what do you think prevents couples from being vulnerable with each other, from having those really open conversations?
Yeah, I think it's the fear factor, right? What if, a lot of times I think it's, what if they judge me? I think that's a really common thing that I see between couples. What if they judge me? Or I tried to share this before and they did judge me, so I know how they're going to react. Again, mind reading.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of it's fear-based. And so it's just easier not to have the conversation until it's not, right? At some point, there's so many things piled up that haven't been said that it creates different problems. But I think a lot of it's fear-based, and we get very wound up in like shame and guilt and judgment. And so it is vulnerable and it doesn't feel good then. It feels uncomfortable. And so why would I want to do something that doesn't feel good?
Yeah. I'm literally thinking about a couple just recently had said to me, well, why should I say it? Because I know exactly how he's going to respond. And I was trying to make the point that, yes, even though they've responded that way 100 times before, there's something to giving our partner the ability to show up differently and surprise us. What the Buddhists think about as a sort of a fresh start or a blank slate kind of, let's talk about this stuff. And even though they've always done this thing, let's hold open the opportunity not to do something different.
And I think that's one of the things I talk about with couples is rather than gearing up for your next, again, either shutting down or getting defensive, it's like, just listen. Because, I'll tell people that you don't have to respond. All you have to say is, thank you for sharing that with me, right? You don't have to get judgmental or commit to something or, just thank you for sharing. And then you can come back and revisit it later. But I think even that is so validating that people go, oh, you're safe. And I think that's part of the scary part too, right? We want to tell our partner something. They're the person we love and trust, hopefully. And so when we feel like we're going to be judged by one of the people we love most in the world, that is scary.
Right. And we might be. One of the barriers to communication is somebody's proclivity to judge and shame their partner.
That's true.
And maybe that's coming out of their own fear too. But
oh, absolutely. Well, and that's, again, part of that conversation is how can we maybe listen without being reactive to something?
Yeah.
Process it before you respond.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think sometimes, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say another thing I talk to people about is just because you are angry with me does not mean I've done something wrong. Just because you were hurt. I think so much of the time in conversations, people feel like, oh, if my partner's having a hard feeling, they're blaming me. I'm in trouble. I've been bad. This must mean I did something wrong. And it's like, no, you can just hear their experience without taking responsibility for it.
Yeah. And I think sometimes even if someone is mad at you, someone can be mad at you and still love you.
Yes.
Right?
That too.
You don't have to immediately get defensive about it because it's okay to be upset sometimes with somebody.
Right.
But let's talk about why you're upset and how do we resolve it, right? And I think that's the part that goes missing a lot is people don't resolve it. So then a small issue becomes a big issue at some point.
Right.
Hi, it's Jessa here, taking just a quick break. Thanks for listening so far. I wanted to let you know about the sex quiz that I've put together called How Healthy Is Your Sex Life? I've taken a close look at the typical ways that I see couples get into trouble with sex, including avoidance, neglect, negativity, distraction, and boredom. And the free quiz will score your individual results based on these factors. And then I provide my recommendations and ideas, including my top 10 sex tips, which will help you make instant improvement. If you'd like to take the quiz and see how healthy your sex life is, you can do it right now at sexhealthquiz.com.
So what are some of the concrete, exercises or tools that you've got for couples around these ideas?
Yeah. So my favorite is the pancake talk. I mean, I coined the pancake talk. It's not like anything super novel, but I think it's effective. So I think, especially when we're talking about sexuality, right? I mean, I think sometimes couples want to process immediately after something happens. And they're in bed and they're naked. So you're already vulnerable.
Yeah, let's talk about how bad this was, right? Like,
exactly. Yes. Either, was that good for you? Did you like it? Did you enjoy it? And it's like, whoa. Or, sometimes somebody maybe wasn't able to perform the way that they wanted to. So they're very disappointed in themselves. And so it's like, let's not have that conversation right now. Let's just figure out a way to make that experience end on a more positive note. And let's just process it. And so, I'll tell people to have the pancake talk. So that means coming back to it a few hours later, the next day, whatever it is, some kind of break though. And pancakes you typically eat in the kitchen. The kitchen is great because it's neutral territory. Don't have that conversation in your office or their office, or especially if you don't live together, right? I mean, how do we find a neutral territory, a neutral setting? Because again, the bedroom is a pretty vulnerable
place.
Right.
Don't do this in the bedroom, right? Not just in the moment around sex, but also in the bedroom. Like, let's get this in another.
Don't do it in the bedroom, period. Especially because sometimes couples, and it turns into an argument, or again, that disappointment. And then they're trying to connect and have intimacy in the same place. They're also fueled by disappointment or resentment. Right. It's a terrible setup. So again, pancakes. Nobody's mad about pancakes. And so, being able to just have your mouth stuffed full of blueberry pancakes and be like, so, how was that for you last night? And what do you think went well? And just being able to have a very casual, take your sip of coffee. Actually, I really enjoyed this. And, I was hoping it would have ended like this, but I still enjoyed X, Y, and Z. And really just trying to normalize it and not be reactive, get away from those high intense emotions. And especially you're eating pancakes, you don't have to make eye contact, it makes the conversation easier and you can always throw in like, how are your pancakes, right? Or whatever, coffee, whatever it is you're eating, but really just trying to keep it a very neutral conversation and keeping low stakes, right? So I feel like pancakes in the kitchen are pretty low stakes. Yeah. And so again, just getting away from like tainting that bedroom space.
Right. Any other concrete suggestions for people to get better around this kind of communication?
That one's my favorite. Obviously, I'm biased. That one is my
really
favorite.
Like pancakes.
They're fine. I just think it's such an easy thing to implement. I think I sometimes talk about the 4 horsemen from John Gottman, so again, being mindful of your response though, and to not get defensive or shut down, but really just listen, right? So some of this is imago therapy too, but I think it's helpful sometimes to have people just repeat back. So what I hear you saying is, you were disappointed about this last night, but you really enjoyed this. Is that right? Right. And just being able to do kind of a mirroring exercise, because then you're forced to slow down the thought process, actually hear what the other person's saying. You're not forced to respond. And then you do get a turn to reciprocate whatever it is you're thinking and feeling. And this is something that I talk about. So communication, especially when people are talking about something like a kink or a fetish, or maybe wanting to talk about being poly or open, something that, is a little more uncomfortable territory and feels more vulnerable than normal. And really being able to have that person. I've just heard so many stories, especially with kink stuff, that the partner goes, "Oh my God, that's disgusting. I would never."
Right.
You don't need to respond that way, right? Just listen. And I think it's very, very okay to go, "Thank you for sharing," and to come back the next day in the kitchen and have pancakes and say, I thought about what you said. I don't think it's something that I would be comfortable doing, but I really appreciate you sharing that with me. The end. Or ask some follow-up questions if you want. But I think sometimes people hear like something vulnerable, especially a sexual act, and hear, "I want you to do this with me," pressure, pressure, pressure. And that's not necessarily what someone's even telling you. They're just saying, "Hey, I'm trying to share this side of myself, and I don't want to keep it a secret."
Yeah, it sort of lines up with one thing I was thinking too, that sometimes if somebody shares, partner A shares with partner B, if they're going to accept that and, "Oh, I hear you, and is this what you're saying?" I think they confuse that with agreeing with the person, right? As if I make space for this, I'm somehow letting this be true, or I'm committed to this thing or whatever, as opposed to, no, it's okay to totally understand what somebody's communicating and not necessarily agree. You're not necessarily going to do this thing, or you can see it differently.
I agree completely. And that goes back to you can love someone and still be mad at somebody.
Yeah.
Right. And I talk about that when I talk with couples with infidelity, and that I think sometimes the person who is betrayed feels like they have no power, so they withhold sex. And being able to have a conversation that if you want to have sex and you both agree, right? Consent. But if you both want to have sex, have sex. It doesn't mean you forgive the person for what they did, or that you're not still processing it, or that it was okay. Because it's complicated, and we are humans and we are complicated. And so same thing, which goes back to the mind reading, right? I think sometimes the affair partner will go, oh, they're not mad at me anymore because we had sex. And it's like, you might want to check in about that, right? That's not what it means. But again, just acknowledging it's more complicated than that.
Right.
We try to make things so all or none. And I try really hard with clients to get away from that all or none, because there's so much gray area, and there are very few things that fit in that simple territory.
Right. How do you encourage people to look at maybe how they were raised and how that affects their comfort with communication or with vulnerability or with emotions or talking about sex? Like it's so impactful, right?
It is so impactful. Are you familiar with Sex Smart by Aileen Zolbrad?
I know. I know the book. I have not read it. So you can fill us in here.
Yes, it's my favorite book that I wish I would have written. I wasn't even in the field at the time, but it's a wonderful book. And she really simplifies things. So sometimes I do a sex history and stuff, but I like utilizing this book as well, or at least ideas from it to have these conversations. But it really simplifies things because we all know what our history and our childhood looked like, right? We can recall the memories and we know who we are now. So it's just putting A and B together. But I find that people have lots of light bulb moments of like, that's why I am the way that I am, right? And once we realize why we do the things we do, then we have better idea of how we could maybe make some changes, right? When you're too close to something, how can you change it? So when you kind of can separate yourself a little bit, then I think you go, my parents didn't communicate very well. I hardly ever saw them talk to each other. All right, I want to do something different in my relationship, right? So I think being able to just talk about that upbringing. And so I'll talk about parents as role models, talk obviously about siblings, peers, what did those conversations look like? And obviously bringing it back to communication, but also sexuality. And, where did you get your sex education growing up? And a lot of times it's, how many times did your parents talk to you about sexuality? It's either 0 or 1 is
right.
Usually the case.
Right. Well, and I know you know this too, right? We have to debunk so many myths about sex, right? The lack of information, the faulty information people have gathered, the impressions they've gotten from media or society. It's like there's a lot of false expectations out there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that is part of it. And so I think that some of it too is again, unwinding those messages. A lot of people come in, and have a religious upbringing too. And so they've got to unwind some of those religious messages. And I think the hard part is a lot of people to go, I know intellectually or like rationally or logically, I know that this isn't true, but emotionally I still carry that and hold on to it. And so again, sometimes it's easier said than done of just having that awareness isn't always enough. But I think that's a case too, where we go, okay, well, how can your partner support you in this, right? That you don't have to do, especially if you're in therapy, you don't have to do this all on your own. How can I be a support? How can your partner be a support? How can we do this together? And again, going back to exercises, what are maybe some talking exercises, probably more for this example, but also touching exercises to be able to unwind some of those messages and kind of rewire what we've thought for so long.
Yeah. So give me, before we wrap up, you talked a little bit about some of the other things in the book. If we're starting with communication and vulnerability and sort of, we got to be able to talk about these things if we're going to make them better. Are there and I know you address so much in there. Are there sections of things that are in there so people know and they know what they might be interested in reading about or talking about?
Yeah. And again, it's going to vary like you said, so much by topic. There's a lot of talking exercises in there. So again, depending on what people are talking about, but like the fantasy chapter has exercise on one. I mean, being able, one of them's a playful exercise of having that with a partner, but some of it's even like, how do I develop a fantasy and what does that even mean? And that goes a little bit to normalizing. I want to normalize this quick because a lot of times heterosexual couples, women get asked, what's your fantasy? And they go, I don't have one. And, heterosexual men, they get so how can she not have a fantasy? And it's like, and so we try to normalize even in there. Fantasy could just be really going out to a nice dinner and like holding hands while you go for a walk on the beach.
It doesn't have to be some wild plot line. Yeah.
It doesn't have to be so wild. So I think that's a fun one for people that are open and interested in like open relationships or polyamory. There's some communication exercises in there. The vulnerability chapter has lots of questions for people to do, but first on their own and then with somebody else if they feel comfortable enough, because they're pretty intense questions, some of them that are vulnerable, right? You're going to feel vulnerable, but being able to process that on your own. So yeah, I mean, there's stuff in there for low libido. There's stuff in there for sexual assault and trauma. And so lots of just kind of things to think about. And how do we process some of this differently or process it at all, right? I mean, some of these I think are things we just don't talk about. So how do we even just start to normalize some of these conversations?
Right. And it sounds like that could be a jumping off point for people. If they want to go more in depth at a particular topic, they can find that 300-page book or whatever, right?
And yes. And there's lots of resources at the end that are exactly like if you read the chapter on, vulnerability and low libido and you're like, okay, I need more on this topic. There are, half a dozen books that are specifically geared for low libido. Go that direction. But again, this is kind of a quick and easy that you can read a chapter and you've at least got some starting places, things to think about, things to do. And so I think that that's a nice jumping off platform. Right. But I would say there's 100% something in there for everybody. And again, I don't think that there's just only one chapter applies. I mean, there are plenty of chapters that apply, even if, again, you just jump to the end of the chapters to read those exercises. Yeah. So if nothing else, sometimes there's some fun ones in there to just like, okay, we're kind of getting bored with, talking about sexual scripts. We're kind of bored with our sexual routine. Let's read this chapter and figure out how do we change things a little bit. Right.
So tell us about the book, where people can get it, where they can find out more about you.
Yeah. My website is Kristen Lilla, KristenLilla.com. And you can order the book directly from there. And yeah, there's my other book that I co-wrote with somebody, Vaginas and Periods 101, a pop-up book. That one's a sex education resource. So totally different topic, but super fun. So yeah, you can find both of those and more about me on my website.
Wonderful. I'll put the site up on the show notes too, so people will be able to access that. So, well, thank you again for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was fun.
Yeah.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.